when people talk about prohibition, this doesn't sever the human connection with drugs, it just takes some drugs off the menu and then other drugs come along. You know, coca leaf, this is, in the Andes, it's very popular to chew it, it's very effective, but it became banned, but then Coca-Cola, is the big commercial product, and the law comes in to separate them, to say, in our culture, this drug, this substance is not allowed. Chocolate was prohibited in Spain, except the Jesuits were the only ones allowed. Tobacco was prohibited in Russia. Usually when these things start, often they make governments or politicians nervous and they ban them, and then when people carry on using them, then they go, okay, we'll just put a tax on it and regulate. Instead of spending money to lock people up in prison and to put them through the court system, instead of that we can use this to make revenue. Tea is another drug, of course, it's psychoactive, we don't call it a drug now, but it became very, very popular in Britain. You could say here in Britain we became addicted to it, but we had to buy it from China, and we didn't have anything the Chinese wanted, so we had to buy it with silver, so it was very expensive for the government, and they started to produce opium and to sell it into China in exchange for tea. So you had this is the drug trade of those days, tea one way, opium the other. Opium was illegal in China, the emperor had prohibited it. So the British East India Company sold that opium to independent traders, and the independent traders smuggled it in. So the British Empire then, the East India Company was behaving like the cartels today, controlling the illegal trade. And then when the Chinese government started to confiscate that opium and burn it and destroy it, the Chinese are destroying our property, our trade goods, and this was the beginning of a war. So the Chinese were trying to control their own rebellious subculture. I think the Opium War was just using opium as an economic weapon. And I think when you really see the prohibition in the West begin in the generation after that, when after this there's poverty and starvation in China. Chinese workers go to San Francisco to build the railway, they come here to London in the docks, and then that's when you start to see the fear that a Chinese opium culture might infect British or American or Western populations, and only to the Chinese, because everybody else, you could go to the chemists and buy opium, but for Chinese people it was banned because it was thought that they might use it to influence as a bad influence on the criminal underworld. President Nixon first said war on drugs, number one danger facing our country. This is really felt that this was an existential threat to Western culture, that if everybody started to take drugs, Western culture would disappear. And I think 50 years later, 60 years later now, we see, well, Western culture is changing very much, it's becoming more multicultural, but it's possible that these drugs are part of that, they're part of our culture now, and not an enemy from outside. It was good for bonding people together, it was good for giving them courage, afterwards it was good for sleeping and dealing with trauma. Then when other drugs came along, like for example amphetamines, were used very widely in the Second World War by all sides. The Nazis used them, the British used them, the Americans used them, but drugs are intensifiers, and so just as much as they have the possibility of extending your reach, they also bring risks that they can take people in different directions which are antisocial and not good for the collective. What the laws on drugs are intended to do, because I think when they started, they separated out people into people who were normal citizens and people who were deviants or undesirable, Now I don't think the drug laws do that, because there are too many people take drugs. Now I think that job is done by the war on terror. That's for the 21st century. This is a much better war for controlling people and separating them. But the problem with the drugs now is that the drugs business is so incredibly valuable, there's so much money. So the politics now becomes about what do we do with the money. Every culture uses plant drugs in some form, but all in very different forms. So I think if you try to go back to the beginning and say, where did this come from? If you look at animals, they're already using plants in different ways to alter their consciousness. whether it's cats with catnip, or whether it's elephants or flocks of birds with, eating lots of fermenting fruit and getting drunk. So I think this is something that is always part of the human experience from the beginning. But then as we separated into many different cultures, it took many, many different forms.
So the British Empire then, the East India Company was behaving like the cartels today.